Something unexpected happened inside your soulmate recently, and the feeling it created may be more meaningful than you realize. For a brief moment, they allowed themselves to imagine what their future could look like with you, and instead of the confusion they once associated with this connection, they felt something completely different. They felt peace. This surprised them because they may have spent a long time believing that thinking about you would only bring complicated emotions. They may have worried about timing, circumstances, distance, vulnerability, or everything that could possibly go wrong. Whenever they allowed themselves to think too far ahead, their mind would immediately interrupt their heart with questions. What if it doesn't work? What if too much has changed? What if the past repeats itself? But recently, something inside them became quieter. They pictured you in their future, even if only for a moment, and they did not feel the need to fight the thought. They simply allowed it to exist, and that calmness caught their attention. Your soulmate may have replayed that moment afterward, wondering why it felt so natural. They were not overwhelmed by excitement. They were not desperately trying to predict what would happen. There was simply a quiet feeling that made the possibility of you feel safe rather than frightening. And because they know how complicated their emotions have been in the past, they could not easily dismiss that experience. It made them question something important. Why does imagining a future with you suddenly feel different now? Perhaps they are beginning to realize that the future they once feared may not be the future their heart actually fears. Maybe what frightened them was uncertainty, vulnerability, and the possibility of losing control. But when they imagine simply being beside you, sharing ordinary moments, and building something genuine, the resistance seems to disappear. And that is where this story begins, because your soulmate is slowly discovering that the peace they felt was not random. It may have revealed how deeply their heart has already begun accepting the possibility of a future they once struggled to imagine. Your soulmate has been thinking about that peaceful moment more than they expected, because something about it felt completely different from the emotions they were used to experiencing whenever they considered a future with you. In the past, even the idea of getting closer may have brought a mixture of excitement and fear. They could imagine beautiful possibilities, but almost immediately their mind would begin creating questions. What would happen if things became serious? What if circumstances made it difficult? What if they became vulnerable and ended up hurt? What if the past repeated itself? These questions often became louder than the feelings themselves, and your soulmate may have interpreted that inner conflict as a sign that something was wrong. But now they are beginning to understand that the problem was not necessarily the connection. The problem may have been their fear of everything the connection represented. Recently, when they allowed themselves to imagine a future with you, those fears did not take over in the same way. Instead, their mind became surprisingly quiet, and that quietness gave them something they had been searching for without realizing it: emotional peace. Because your heart needs to hear this. Peace can feel unfamiliar to someone who has spent a long time protecting themselves. Your soulmate may have expected a meaningful connection to feel intense, complicated, or uncertain. They may have believed that if something mattered deeply, it should create constant emotional excitement. But now they are discovering that genuine emotional security can feel completely different. It can feel quiet. It can feel natural. It can feel like not having to constantly question every little thing. When they imagined you in their future, they did not feel the same urge to control every possible outcome. They simply imagined being with you and noticed that the thought did not feel heavy anymore. Perhaps they imagined something very ordinary, not a dramatic romantic scene, not some perfect fantasy, but a normal moment where you were simply part of their everyday life. Maybe they imagined talking with you after a long day, sharing something that happened, laughing about something small, or simply sitting together without needing to fill every silence. And strangely enough, those ordinary images may have affected them more than any grand romantic fantasy could. They began realizing that what they truly want may not be something complicated. They may want companionship that feels safe, honest, and emotionally comfortable. And listen carefully, because this is where your soulmate's perspective begins to shift. They are starting to understand that their heart does not necessarily feel peaceful because they know exactly what the future will bring. They feel peaceful because they are finally allowing themselves to consider the possibility without immediately rejecting it. That distinction matters. They are no longer trying to predict every detail. They are no longer demanding guarantees before allowing themselves to feel hopeful. They are simply giving themselves permission to imagine what could happen. For a long time, your soulmate may have believed that uncertainty meant they should step away. If they could not guarantee the outcome, they felt safer keeping their distance. But now they are beginning to understand that no meaningful relationship comes with complete certainty. At some point, trust has to replace the need for control. A person has to be willing to move forward without knowing every chapter of the story. And this realization is making the idea of a future with you feel much less intimidating. There is also something else your soulmate is beginning to notice. When they imagine other possible futures, their mind may immediately start analyzing them. They think about compatibility, expectations, responsibilities, and whether everything would work logically. But when they imagine you, something different happens. They may still think about practical realities, but underneath those thoughts is a sense of emotional familiarity. It feels less like constructing a future from scratch and more like recognizing something that already feels meaningful. This does not mean your soulmate has suddenly decided that everything will happen exactly as they imagine. Their peace is not necessarily a prediction. It is an emotional realization. They are discovering how their own heart responds when they stop fighting the possibility. And that response is telling them something important. Maybe they have spent too much time focusing on what could go wrong and not enough time acknowledging what feels right, because your heart needs this right now. Your soulmate is also beginning to understand why they once felt so conflicted. The connection may have touched parts of them that they were not prepared to handle. You may have awakened a level of vulnerability that made them uncomfortable. They may have cared more than they wanted to admit, and caring deeply created the possibility of loss. So they tried to protect themselves by creating emotional distance. But now, after everything they have experienced, they are realizing that distance did not necessarily bring them peace. It only gave them more time to think about what they were trying to avoid. The peaceful feeling they recently experienced has therefore become important to them because it showed them another possibility. They can think about you without immediately feeling overwhelmed. They can imagine a future without instantly searching for reasons to reject it. They can allow themselves to feel something without demanding an immediate answer. And perhaps this is the most surprising part. Your soulmate may have realized that they were not actually afraid of a future with you. They were afraid of admitting how much they wanted one. There is a difference. The first fear says, "This future could hurt me." The second realization says, "This future matters enough that I'm afraid to lose it." Once they understand that difference, many things begin to make sense. Now they are looking at their emotions with greater honesty. They are asking themselves what kind of future would genuinely make them happy. What kind of connection would allow them to feel emotionally safe, and who they could imagine sharing ordinary life with, rather than simply experiencing temporary excitement. And when your presence enters those thoughts, they notice that unusual calmness again. That is why this moment may stay with your soulmate for a long time. It was not simply a pleasant thought. It showed them what their emotional world feels like when resistance disappears. It gave them a glimpse of what it might be like to stop fighting the possibility and simply allow their heart to speak. And as they continue reflecting on that feeling, another realization is slowly forming. Perhaps peace was not telling them that every detail of the future is already decided. Perhaps it was simply showing them that they no longer need to be afraid of imagining you in it. And that small change in perspective may become much more powerful than they realize, because once someone stops fearing the future they once avoided, they become ready to discover what that future could actually mean. And now, something even deeper is beginning to happen inside your soulmate, because after feeling that unexpected peace, they are no longer looking at the future in the same way. Before, they may have thought about what could go wrong. Now they are beginning to think about what could go right. That is a major emotional shift. They are not suddenly ignoring reality or pretending that life will always be simple. Instead, they are allowing themselves to imagine what a healthy and meaningful future could actually look like. And surprisingly, when they picture that future, your presence keeps appearing naturally. They are not forcing your image into it. They are simply noticing that when they imagine the kind of life they genuinely want, you somehow fit into that picture. Your soulmate may be thinking about the small things more than the dramatic ones. They may imagine having someone they can call after a difficult day. They may picture sharing good news with you before anyone else. They may imagine sitting together and talking about ordinary things, laughing about something that would mean nothing to anyone else, or simply enjoying the comfort of being around someone who does not require them to constantly explain themselves. These details may seem simple, but they are exactly what is making the future feel peaceful. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that they are not searching for a perfect life. They are searching for a life that feels emotionally real, because your heart needs this right now. This realization may be changing what they value in a relationship. They may have once focused heavily on attraction, excitement, timing, or circumstances. Now they are thinking about emotional safety, trust, consistency, understanding, and the ability to grow together without losing themselves. And when they compare those qualities with what they experience with you, certain memories become much more meaningful. They remember moments when communication felt natural. They remember feeling seen in ways they did not expect. They remember how certain conversations stayed in their mind long after they ended. They are realizing that those moments may have been more important than they understood at the time. Listen carefully, because your soulmate may also be recognizing something about the difference between temporary excitement and lasting peace. Excitement can be powerful, but it can also disappear quickly. Peace is different. Peace tends to remain quietly in the background. It does not demand attention. It simply makes something feel right enough to stop fighting. And when your soulmate recently imagined a future with you, that is what they felt. They did not feel the need to convince themselves. They did not feel the need to create some perfect fantasy. They simply felt that being beside you could be something they would genuinely enjoy building toward. This may have caused them to revisit some of the decisions they made in the past. They may wonder whether they were too focused on protecting themselves. They may question whether they allowed fear to become louder than their genuine feelings. They may remember opportunities when they could have been more open but chose silence instead. Yet rather than becoming trapped in regret, they are beginning to see those experiences as lessons. They cannot change what happened, but they can change how they respond now, and that is why this peaceful feeling is becoming so important. It is showing them that they do not have to approach the future from the same emotional place they once occupied. They can be more patient. They can communicate more honestly. They can acknowledge uncertainty without immediately assuming something is wrong. They can allow a relationship to develop naturally rather than trying to predict every possible outcome before taking a single step. Your soulmate may also be realizing that a future with you does not have to happen exactly according to some perfect plan. Perhaps they once imagined that if this connection were meant to work, everything would have to align effortlessly. Now they are beginning to understand that real relationships involve choices, timing, conversations, growth, and patience. The important thing is not whether every circumstance is perfect. The important thing is whether two people are willing to meet each other with honesty when the opportunity appears. And this thought may be giving your soulmate an unexpected sense of relief. They do not have to know every answer today. They do not have to know exactly what tomorrow will bring. They only need to recognize what feels meaningful enough to explore. That is why the future with you no longer feels like a heavy question. It is becoming an open possibility. Perhaps they are even beginning to imagine what it would feel like if you were truly part of their everyday life. Not just during exciting moments, but during ordinary ones. They may imagine supporting each other through stressful days, celebrating achievements, encouraging personal growth, and creating memories that have nothing to do with dramatic romance. And the more ordinary the picture becomes, the more peaceful it feels. That is what makes this realization so powerful. They are not simply imagining a fantasy. They are imagining companionship. There may also be a growing desire within your soulmate to become someone who is capable of sustaining that kind of connection. They are thinking about what they need to heal within themselves. They may be recognizing old habits that created distance. They may be learning to communicate instead of withdrawing. They may be becoming more comfortable with vulnerability. They may be realizing that love cannot grow properly when one person is constantly protecting themselves from being hurt. This internal growth is important because their peaceful reaction to your future is not only about what they want from you, it is also about what they are willing to bring into the connection themselves. They are beginning to understand that if they want something stable, they must become emotionally stable enough to participate in it. If they want honesty, they must be honest. If they want trust, they must be willing to trust. If they want closeness, they must stop creating distance whenever they become afraid. And perhaps that is why this moment feels different from everything that came before. Your soulmate is not simply imagining you. They are imagining the version of themselves who could actually build something meaningful with you. The more they think about it, the less the future feels like something distant or impossible. It becomes a possibility that deserves respect. They may still have questions, but the questions no longer carry the same fear. They are curious instead of anxious. They are hopeful instead of overwhelmed. They are reflective instead of resistant. And then comes the realization that may surprise them the most. The peace they felt was not necessarily because they suddenly discovered what the future will be. It was because, for one moment, their heart stopped arguing with itself. They allowed themselves to picture you beside them, and nothing inside them demanded that they run away. That quiet moment may have revealed more than they expected. It showed them that beneath all the confusion, there is still a part of them that can imagine a future with you and feel calm while doing it. And now that they have experienced that peace, they may never look at the possibility of your future together in exactly the same way again. Your soulmate is beginning to understand why that feeling of peace appeared so suddenly, and the answer is taking them deeper than they expected. At first, they thought it was simply a passing emotional moment, something that would disappear once they became distracted by everyday responsibilities. But the feeling stayed with them. Even after they moved on with their day, some part of their mind kept returning to that quiet image of you being part of their future. What surprised them most was not the thought itself, but the way their entire emotional state changed when they allowed that thought to remain. There was no need to force anything. There was no desperate desire to know exactly what would happen. There was simply a sense of familiarity, as though imagining a life where you were present did not feel like creating something completely unknown. It felt strangely natural, and this has caused your soulmate to look at the connection from a completely different perspective, because your heart needs this right now. Your soulmate may have started comparing this feeling with the emotions they experienced in other situations. They are remembering moments when they tried to imagine different futures, different relationships, different possibilities, and how much mental effort those thoughts required. They may have found themselves constantly analyzing whether something was right, whether they were making the correct choice, whether they were emotionally prepared, or whether they could trust what they were feeling. But when they think about you, something seems to happen differently. Their mind may still have questions, but their heart does not feel like it is fighting the thought. There is less resistance, less pressure, less of that exhausting feeling that they have to convince themselves to want something. And listen carefully, because this realization may be one of the biggest emotional discoveries your soulmate has made recently. They are beginning to understand that love does not always announce itself through overwhelming intensity. Sometimes the deepest realization arrives through peace. Sometimes it is not the racing heartbeat that tells someone something matters. Sometimes it is the moment when they can finally breathe and realize, I could actually see myself being happy here. Your soulmate may have expected the thought of a future with you to create fear because of everything that happened before. Instead, it gave them a sense of emotional safety that they were not expecting. They may have started imagining the small details of life with you, and those details are becoming more meaningful than the grand ideas they once focused on. They may picture having someone to talk to after a difficult day. They may imagine sharing small victories that nobody else would understand. They may picture sitting beside you in comfortable silence without feeling the need to prove anything. They may imagine laughing over something completely ordinary, making plans together, supporting each other when life becomes difficult, or simply knowing that there is someone who genuinely understands the person they are becoming. These thoughts are not necessarily dramatic, but they carry something powerful. They feel peaceful. That is when your soulmate begins to realize that what they may have been searching for was not constant excitement. They were searching for a connection where they could finally lower their emotional defenses. They wanted to feel understood without having to explain every part of themselves. They wanted to feel accepted without constantly wondering whether they were enough. And when they imagine you in that space, something inside them becomes calmer. This does not mean they believe you are perfect or that a future together would never have challenges. It means the emotional foundation they imagine feels worth exploring. Your soulmate is also beginning to recognize how much their previous fears influenced the way they viewed the connection. They may have confused uncertainty with incompatibility. They may have mistaken vulnerability for danger. They may have believed that because the journey was complicated, the connection itself must have been wrong. But now they are questioning that conclusion. They are realizing that sometimes difficult circumstances can surround something meaningful without defining its emotional value. A complicated chapter does not necessarily mean the entire story was meaningless, and this new understanding is making them revisit memories they once interpreted differently. They remember moments when they felt comfortable around you without knowing why. They remember conversations that seemed effortless. They remember how certain emotions appeared naturally instead of being forced. They may even remember moments when they felt like they could be completely themselves around you. At the time, they might not have understood the importance of those experiences. Now they are looking back with greater emotional maturity, and those memories seem to carry a different message, because your heart needs this. Your soulmate is slowly learning to distinguish between emotional intensity and emotional compatibility. They may have experienced situations in the past where everything felt exciting but unstable, where attraction created uncertainty rather than peace. They may have mistaken emotional chaos for passion because they were accustomed to believing that strong feelings had to be difficult. But thinking about you is teaching them another possibility. A meaningful connection can still be deep without constantly feeling like a battle. It can have emotion without emotional exhaustion. It can have uncertainty without creating constant fear. This realization may also explain why your soulmate recently felt such a deep sense of peace when imagining a future with you. They were not necessarily imagining perfection. They were imagining emotional balance. They were imagining a life where they did not have to constantly question where they stood. They were imagining the possibility of being with someone who feels familiar to their heart, while still allowing both people to grow individually. And that thought may have touched something inside them that had been searching for stability for a very long time. There is another important realization happening beneath all of this. Your soulmate is beginning to understand that peace does not mean there will never be challenges. It means they no longer feel the need to run simply because challenges exist. Before, they may have believed that a future had to be completely certain before they could trust it. Now they are realizing that uncertainty is simply part of being human. No one knows every detail of tomorrow. What matters is whether the people involved are willing to communicate, grow, and face difficult moments together. And this has changed the way they think about you. Instead of asking, "Can I guarantee that this will work?" they may now be asking, "Would this be worth trying honestly?" That is a much more mature question. It does not demand certainty before allowing hope. It allows possibility to exist without forcing an outcome. Your soulmate may also be realizing that their peaceful reaction came because, for once, they were not imagining a future based on pressure. They were not imagining what other people expected from them. They were not imagining what would look impressive from the outside. They were imagining what would actually feel meaningful to them. And when they removed all those outside expectations, your presence remained in the picture. That realization can be powerful because it forces them to confront what they genuinely want. They may have spent a long time choosing what seemed practical, acceptable, or emotionally safe. But now they are beginning to ask whether safety without fulfillment is really the kind of future they want. They are discovering that there is a difference between being comfortable with a situation and feeling at peace with it. And when they imagine you, the difference becomes clearer. Perhaps this is why they have been quieter lately. Their silence may not necessarily mean nothing is happening. Sometimes a person becomes quiet when they are processing something that feels too significant to explain immediately. Your soulmate may be trying to understand why the thought of you has become less frightening and more comforting. They may be wondering why, after everything that happened, the idea of building something with you can still feel so natural. The answer may be simpler than they expected. Their heart has stopped demanding that everything be perfect before it allows itself to feel hopeful. They are finally letting themselves imagine a future without immediately destroying the image with fear. And once they experience that kind of peace, it becomes difficult to completely forget it. They may return to the thought again and again, not because they are obsessing over an imagined future, but because that moment showed them something about themselves. It showed them what they feel when they stop resisting. That is the real shift happening now. Your soulmate is not simply thinking more about you. They are beginning to understand what their feelings mean. They are discovering that beneath the uncertainty, there may be a quiet desire for something genuine, stable, and emotionally fulfilling. And the more honestly they acknowledge that desire, the more they begin to wonder whether the future they once considered impossible might actually be the future their heart has been quietly preparing them to accept. And now your soulmate is beginning to understand why that quiet feeling of peace affected them so deeply. Because the real realization was never simply about imagining a future with you. It was about discovering what happens inside them when they finally stop fighting the possibility. For so long, they may have carried questions, fears, and emotional resistance whenever they thought about where this connection could go. They may have wondered whether the timing was right, whether circumstances would allow it, or whether opening their heart again would only create more uncertainty. But recently something changed. They allowed themselves to imagine you as part of their future without immediately searching for a reason why it could not happen. And instead of feeling overwhelmed, they felt calm. That calmness may have revealed something their mind had been trying to understand for a very long time, because your heart needs this right now. Your soulmate is beginning to recognize that peace does not always mean knowing exactly what will happen. Sometimes peace simply means no longer needing to fight what you feel. They do not have every answer. They cannot predict every circumstance. They cannot know exactly how the future will unfold. But they are beginning to understand that they do not need complete certainty to acknowledge what feels meaningful. The future can remain unknown while the emotion remains genuine. This realization is helping them release some of the pressure they once placed on the connection. They may have believed that they needed to know immediately whether this was going to become something permanent before allowing themselves to feel hopeful. Now they are beginning to understand that relationships are built one honest moment at a time. You do not need to know every chapter before taking the next step. You only need enough trust to remain open to what comes next, and listen carefully, because your soulmate may now be looking at you through a different emotional lens. They are not simply remembering what happened between you. They are thinking about what could happen if both of you approach the connection with greater maturity and understanding. They may be imagining conversations that were never completed, moments that could have unfolded differently, and possibilities that were once dismissed too quickly. But this time, they are not allowing fear to write the ending before the story has even had a chance to continue. The peace they experienced may also be showing them what they truly want from love. They are beginning to realize that they do not want a connection where they are constantly questioning their place. They do not want emotional games, endless uncertainty, or the feeling that they have to become someone else to be accepted. They want something where they can breathe, something where they can be honest, something where two people can grow without constantly fearing that vulnerability will destroy everything. And when they imagine that kind of relationship, your presence may feel surprisingly natural. They may picture you beside them during ordinary moments, not because they are creating some perfect fantasy, but because their heart associates you with a feeling they have struggled to explain. A feeling of familiarity, a feeling of emotional comfort, a feeling that perhaps this connection does not need to be as complicated as their fear once made it seem. Your soulmate is also learning that peace and excitement can exist together. They do not have to choose between a deep emotional connection and emotional stability. They can feel strongly while still feeling safe. They can care deeply without losing themselves. They can imagine a future without becoming consumed by the fear of losing it. This balance may be exactly what they were missing before. There is another layer to this realization that your soulmate may not have expected. They are beginning to understand that their peaceful reaction was also a reflection of how much they have personally changed. Perhaps they would not have been able to feel this way months or years ago. Perhaps they needed time to experience certain lessons, understand certain patterns, and grow through certain emotional challenges. The person who once feared the future may now be becoming someone capable of embracing it. That means this moment is not simply about you. It is also about them. They are becoming more emotionally aware. They are learning to listen to themselves. They are learning that not every difficult emotion needs to be escaped. They are learning that love requires courage, patience, and honesty. And because of that growth, the idea of a future with you no longer feels like something they need to immediately reject, perhaps. They are even beginning to wonder whether the peace they felt was the result of finally accepting something their heart already knew. They may have spent so long searching for external confirmation that they forgot to listen to their own emotional experience. But when they imagined you in their future, there was a moment when everything became quiet. No arguments, no endless analysis, no need to prove anything. Just a simple internal feeling that said, this could be okay. And sometimes that is enough to change someone's perspective. Your soulmate may still have fears. They may still have practical concerns. They may still wonder about timing and circumstances. But those things no longer seem capable of completely overpowering the possibility. They are learning to hold uncertainty and hope at the same time. They are learning that not knowing the ending does not mean the story has no value. So if your soulmate has seemed distant, quiet, or unusually reflective, there may be more happening inside them than you can see. They may be processing the realization that thinking about you no longer brings the same emotional resistance. They may be sitting with the possibility of a future that once seemed too complicated to imagine. And instead of running from that thought, they are allowing it to remain. The most beautiful part is that they are not necessarily demanding that the universe give them an immediate answer. They are simply becoming open to the possibility. And that openness changes everything, because once a person stops rejecting something internally, they become more capable of recognizing opportunities externally. Perhaps a future together will unfold differently than either of you expects. Perhaps circumstances will require patience. Perhaps the next chapter will begin with something very small rather than something dramatic. But your soulmate is beginning to understand that the most important change has already happened inside them. They no longer look at the possibility of you and immediately feel fear. They feel peace, and that peaceful feeling may stay with them because it gave them something they could not force through logic. It showed them what their heart feels like when it is no longer fighting itself. It showed them that imagining you in their future does not have to feel like carrying a burden. It can feel like breathing more freely. So perhaps the message here is not that every detail of your future is already decided. It is something more grounded and meaningful. Your soulmate has reached a place where the idea of a future with you no longer feels impossible. They are becoming emotionally open to it. They are beginning to trust the calmness they feel instead of automatically questioning it, and that is why this moment matters. Because sometimes the greatest emotional turning points do not happen through dramatic actions. Sometimes they happen when someone quietly closes their eyes, imagines the life they truly want, sees someone familiar standing beside them, and realizes that for the first time they are not afraid of what they see. They feel at peace, and perhaps your soulmate is finally understanding that this peace was never about having every answer. It was about finally allowing their heart to imagine a future without fear standing between them and the possibility.